In the heart of the Middle East, there is a region known as the Fertile Crescent. It is believed to be the very first place with organized farming, in which humans cleared and modified vegetation to grow crops. Within this region was Mesopotamia, where several of the world's first known civilizations emerged thousands of years ago. In ancient Mesopotamia, you had gardens, you had control of water. Now it's completely different. Now it's arid. You look at that place and think, well, wait, what was this? The climate was different. The vegetation was completely different then. Often called the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia was the home of the Akkadian Empire that arose in 2334 BC. The Assyrian Empire that began in 2025 BC. And the Babylonian Empire, established in 1894 BC. For centuries, archaeologists thought these were the earliest peoples to inhabit the area. But in the 1800s, ancient clay tablets were discovered that would dramatically alter the established timeline for human civilization. In the 19th century, it was a time of great exploration in Mesopotamia, and their finding these cuneiform tablets. And there were various languages involved with these tablets. You had Akkadian, you had Assyrian, you had Babylonian. But in the mid-1800s, the Reverend Edward Hincks, an Irish scholar with Trinity College Dublin, began to notice there was evidence of a much older script. And this was very important. It meant that there must be some other earlier civilization. In 1869, more than 2 decades after Edward Hincks discovered this unique cuneiform language, archaeologists gave it the name Sumerian, and this was based on Akkadian writings that referenced the land of Sumer, which scholars believe to be the place where the mysterious language originated. Then, in 1877, at the ancient site of Gursu in present-day Iraq, 9 massive stone statues were found, all depicting a king named Gudea who ruled over 4,100 years ago. Engraved on each of the statues was Sumerian writing, indicating to scholars that these were the first depictions ever found of a Sumerian. The discovery of the Gudea statues at Gursu was definitive proof that Sumerian cuneiform text came from a lost civilization. And the fact is, people have been discovering Sumerian structures and artifacts and crediting them to other civilizations. So now they knew there was a civilization called the Sumerians. But it wasn't until the 1920s, where thousands of artifacts and cuneiform text had been discovered, that they realized how far this civilization went back. In 1928, an article appeared in the Scientific American magazine with the subtitle, "Who were the ancient Sumerians? No one knows." But after nearly a century of collecting clues, archaeologists had determined at least one indisputable fact. The Sumerians were the earliest civilization ever discovered, emerging around 5000 BC and predating all other known civilizations by at least 2,500 years. The Sumerians disappeared from sight entirely. They were extinct like the dinosaurs. And the only reason that we know about them today is with the advent of archaeology, when people excavated in the Middle East and they found evidence of the Sumerians and their archaeology and their writing. Once archaeologists became aware of the Sumerian civilization, they launched major excavations in Iraq and began to discover that the Sumerians were responsible for many world-changing innovations, like the wheel. The first stone potter's wheel with an axle was found in the Sumerian city of Ur and dated to 3129 BC. This eventually led to the first wheeled vehicles. Most of the things that we take for granted, the Sumerians invented. That's why they're so crucially important. The Sumerians are key in writing. The Sumerians are key in mathematics. The Sumerians are the ones that invent the plow. They're the ones that first start to work copper. They're the ones that first understand how to smelt metals. The Sumerians also built some of the first known pyramidal structures. When it comes to the Sumerian ziggurats and the temples they constructed, most of the construction was made of mud brick. And so much of this is either washed away or been buried over time. But there are elements of the temple, such as the giant statues, which have survived. They are made of stone, and some of them were in amazing condition. According to mainstream historians, the first ziggurats were built around 4000 BC, predating the earliest step pyramids in Egypt by 1300 years. But perhaps even more impressive is that the Sumerians designed these structures by using an advanced counting system. One of the first civilizations to really implement mathematics was the ancient Sumerians. And the interesting thing is they used mathematics on a base 60 system, that's called sexagesimal, as opposed to the decimal system with 10 that we use today. It gives you much more flexibility in the use of numbers than if you just use a decimal system. And it led to all sorts of extraordinary discoveries in mathematics, in astronomy, and other things as well. For example, they could make accurate plans of a major building to scale, and they could calculate how many bricks they needed. In fact, they had a very modern approach to the practical problems of, for example, architecture and calculation. While much has been discovered over the past 100 years about the Sumerians and their accomplishments, the origin of this highly developed culture remains a mystery. What's remarkable about the Sumerians is nobody knows where they came from. We don't know where they were. The ancient Sumerians had technology, they had science. This is even thousands of years before the great rise of the civilizations in Egypt. Where did this knowledge come from? How did they acquire such profound information? What could explain how this mysterious group of people so rapidly advanced from hunter-gatherers to form the world's first civilization? According to ancient astronaut theorists, the answer can be found by examining the recently translated Sumerian tablets that describe otherworldly beings who descended from the sky. When archaeologists began uncovering Sumerian relics in the 19th century, they knew nothing about this long-lost civilization. Artifacts offered few clues about the Sumerian culture, and many of their structures, which were made from mud bricks, had almost completely eroded. But fortunately, what did manage to survive the ravages of time were thousands of clay tablets containing Sumerian writing. The Sumerians had a fully developed phonetic language that they had written on clay tablets in what's called cuneiform. Cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning literally wedge. What they did is they had reed styluses that had a wedge shape, and they would use wet clay and imprint those into such a way that it would be writing. One of the great things that the Sumerians did was precisely writing. With a stylus in clay, and then firing the clay so it becomes a brick. And over the centuries, that brick becomes essentially stone. And so unlike papyrus that gets damaged, we find out all the time about papyri that get discovered, and we can't open them. They're too fragile. That's not the case with these tablets. The first tablets were discovered before archaeologists were even aware that there was a Sumerian civilization. But linguists received an important tool to help decipher them in 1850. British archaeologist, Austen Henry Leonard, was leading excavation efforts at an ancient Assyrian palace when he came upon a library of more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets. Some of the tablets contained not only the mysterious writing that would later be identified as Sumerian, but also Babylonian cuneiform next to it, which linguists had deciphered a few years earlier. Finally, scholars had what they needed to translate the unknown language. But it would be several more decades before they could effectively read the texts. It wasn't until the early 20th century that we could actually translate these cuneiform tablets. And so we went for a period of many thousands of years not knowing about these people, then suddenly there's an explosion of knowledge about them in the 20th century. The ancient Mesopotamians, they used those clay tablets for all sorts of documents, private and permanent, and long-term and short-term. Then we can read them today as if they'd just been written. Researchers discovered detailed business ledgers, official government correspondence, and even medical texts. But most interesting to ancient astronaut theorists is a set of 7 tablets, known as the Enuma Elish, that describe powerful beings who came down from the sky. The Enuma Elish consists of 2 different books. And in both books, it speaks that long ago, the gods created humans in order to spread knowledge here on planet Earth. The Enuma Elish is a very important creation myth. And it indicated that these gods, what they call the Anunnaki, which quite literally means from the sky to the earth, came to create man in their image. The Anunnaki are the founder gods of their civilization, and they were masters of the arts and sciences, bringing civilizing qualities to this part of the world. So for the Sumerians, their knowledge wasn't self-derived. Their inventions, their great things, were not of their own design. They were taught by the gods. The Anunnaki nurtured the Sumerians to create this great civilization. But who were the Anunnaki? Were they extraterrestrials? That's what the Sumerians are saying. Could it be that the Anunnaki were not gods, but otherworldly visitors? Ancient astronaut theorists say yes, and suggest further evidence can be found in a recently translated Sumerian tablet that sheds new light on a famous story of the Bible. London, England, 2014. Dr. Irving Finkel, one of the world's foremost experts on cuneiform writing and a curator at the British Museum, publishes a translation of a Sumerian tablet that dates back 3,700 years. The text contains a passage that is nearly identical to the biblical story of Noah and the Great Flood. Now anybody who's ever read the book of Genesis and knows about the flood, there with an ark and Noah and the animals of both genders and so forth, is astonished when they read the Sumerian text for the first time. Because it's a funny thing, they are the same story. When this tablet came across the desk, to me, it was one of those heart-stopping Moments. The tablet is at least 1,000 years older than the story in the Bible. So of course this means that the Sumerian story and the biblical story are inseparably bound together. There's no doubt about it. The tablet deciphered by Dr. Finkel is part of a Sumerian story known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, whose protagonist is believed to be based on a historical king who ruled in the 3rd millennium BC. The oldest story in the Western world is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a story that's at least 4,000 years old. It covers a lot of things, but among other things, the restless search for immortality and the fact that man was deprived of immortality. In addition to descriptions of a great flood, the Epic of Gilgamesh also includes the story of the Anunnaki and their relationship with humankind. According to the text, Enlil, who is the Anunnaki king, is in conflict with his brother Enki, who is the creator of the first humans. Enki is seen as benevolent and an advocate for the advancement of humankind, but Enlil is seen as sort of militaristic and anti-human. And so throughout the Sumerian epics, there's this continuing battle between these two opposing forces, these brothers. The two brothers have very different thoughts about this new human race that is rapidly multiplying. King Enlil wants to send a great deluge to Earth to destroy humankind, which he sees as getting out of control. But Enki fights to save the civilization he had helped to create. In the story, we're told that Enki takes aside one of the human beings and tells him to build an ark and to take them to safety. According to the Sumerians themselves, there's this other civilization that's pre-flood, and it had all of this knowledge as well. They had writing, they had the wheel, they had mathematics, they had all these agricultural sciences too. But the flood wiped out these people. What was left were the Sumerians. After the flood, it was said that the gods imparted specific knowledge and wisdom and teachings to certain Sumerians to go and restart civilization, and this is where the whole Sumerian culture is said to have emerged from. Could the fact that the same account of a great flood appears in both the Hebrew Bible and the Sumerian story written at least 1,000 years earlier support the notion that this was a real event, one caused by otherworldly visitors? And if so, who were these beings? Perhaps further clues can be found by examining an alternate translation of the Sumerian tablets that reveals incredible and highly controversial details about the Anunnaki. New York City, 1976. A controversial book is published called The 12th Planet, which contains a new translation of ancient Sumerian tablets. Its author, 56-year-old Zechariah Sitchin, is a Sumerian researcher who has spent more than a decade studying the cuneiform writing. Sitchin's translation suggests that the origins of the Sumerian civilization and their gods, the Anunnaki, are far more profound than mainstream scholars suggest. Zechariah Sitchin was in a unique position, being raised on the Hebrew Bible, being able to speak ancient languages, and specifically being able to translate cuneiform script. He was able to deduce the story and tell us what's the meaning behind a lot of these tablets. Zechariah Sitchin was a brilliant man, and the idea of the Anunnaki in his meaning were the teachers from outer space. The Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors. They were here, and they created humans according to their own image. In Sitchin's interpretation of the Sumerian stories, after the flood, the Anunnaki return to the earth, but they start to take a sort of a step away from humanity. In fact, they start to vanish from the story. But they leave behind teachers who instruct humanity in the various arts and sciences and rudimentary knowledge about civilization and how to conduct themselves. This, according to Sitchin, is the origin of the Sumerians. This is where they got their knowledge. This is why they're the first with all of their discoveries and inventions, and it comes from the Anunnaki. While the Sumerians themselves identified the Anunnaki as beings who came down from the sky, most scholars interpreted them as fictional characters. But Sitchin claimed that the texts are clearly historical accounts of extraterrestrials that the Sumerians encountered, and he says they even specify what planet these visitors came from. Zacharias Sitchin postulates that the Anunnaki were actually ancient astronauts coming from a planet he called Nibiru, a planet that was out of our vision, and that it was on an elliptical trajectory, and that it only came by Earth every 3,000 or so years. As Sitchin anticipated, when he introduced the world to his controversial translation of the Sumerian creation story in the 1970s, the academic community was quick to dismiss it. These critics claimed that a planet with an elliptical orbit like Nibiru could never exist in Earth's solar system. But 40 years later, in 2016, astronomers at Caltech announced that they had found evidence of a new celestial object just beyond Pluto. The recent discovery by two astronomers at Caltech is incredible. They find evidence that in our solar system, there could be a planet X that goes around the solar system perhaps 173,000 years in a highly elliptical orbit, while astronomers have yet to confirm the existence of Planet X. Some researchers believe its theoretical location and orbit align exactly with what Zacharias Sitchin claimed to find 40 years earlier in the ancient Sumerian tablets. But another discovery in the 1980s echoed one of his even more profound theories. A pillar of Zacharias Sitchin's hypothesis was his belief that the Anunnaki had genetically altered the human genome around 250,000 years ago. Now we have discovered something quite remarkable. Scientists looking into the human genome discovered a genetic alteration that fused two of our chromosomes into one very important chromosome around 250,000 years ago that suddenly unlocked human potential, gave us our human abilities, including the ability to do mathematics, to produce art, to do science. Might the discovery that the human genome underwent a major change 250,000 years ago help to validate Sitchin's translation of the cuneiform tablets? Could the Anunnaki have played a role in creating humans as described in the Sumerian texts? Ancient astronaut theorists say yes, and suggest this also lends support to the notion that human DNA was manipulated by extraterrestrials. It's amazing to see that somewhere this new genetic makeup began, and there is nobody before that had this. So how did this all happen? A group of extraterrestrials arrived on our planet, and one of our ancestors called it an ape. Or whatever, it doesn't matter. They took a few cells, they changed the DNA code in the cell because of this artificial mutation. We are breaking out of the family tree. This is handed down in Sumerian cuneiform. It is always a question of translation. How do you look at these things? Could Zechariah Sitchin's translation be correct? Were the Anunnaki real extraterrestrial beings who helped the Sumerians develop their civilization and also taught them about the creation of humankind? And if so, is there any physical evidence to support their stories of alien visitation? Ancient astronaut theorists say yes and point to a site that Contains the largest megalithic stone blocks ever discovered. Southern Iraq, 2022. Archaeologists from the British Museum are excavating the ancient site of Gursu when they uncover ancient walls made of mud bricks. It would soon be determined that these walls were part of two temples, built roughly 4,500 years ago to venerate the Sumerian god Nin-Gursu. They announced the discovery of the Lord Palace of the Kings and the White Thunderbird Temple. Now these are mythical sites that have been looked for generations. These were only recorded in tablets and text previously, and the whole Thunderbird mythos is related to Nin-Gursu. Nin-Gursu was a thunderbird that was like the avatar of this kind of great god. The reason why this temple was constructed is that a king of the local city-state had had a series of dreams about the god Nin-Gursu. The story of the thunderbird god Nin-Gursu comes from the account of King Gudea, the same king whose statues were found at this very site in 1877. Discovered alongside those statues were the largest cuneiform cylinders yet discovered, inscribed by King Gudea himself. Gudea wrote that the giant winged god Nin-Gursu instructed him to build these two temples to honor him. The archaeologists themselves say that this temple was built due to a vision that a man had where a gigantic thunderbird descended from the sky, and personally I think that this has to do with extraterrestrials, because if you know nothing about high technology and somebody descends from the sky in a vehicle, well, of course you're going to signify a person with wings, because they came from the sky. Could it be that King Gudea's account of a giant winged deity was in fact an encounter with some type of aerial vehicle carrying an extraterrestrial visitor? Ancient astronaut theorists say yes and suggest further evidence that the Sumerians witnessed alien craft coming down from the sky can be found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh encounters the Anunnaki at what's called the landing place. The landing place is where the gods came to meet with Gilgamesh. In the text it talks about sort of a ship that goes from here to the heavens. In the ancient world, that's the gods who are transporting in chariots. In the modern world, is that a spacecraft? Is that a rocket ship? Gilgamesh was watching the gods descending and ascending from the planet. He actually talks about hearing loud sounds and seeing fire and smoke as the gods took off into the heavens. To me this sounds exactly like a rocket ship. In his book, The 12th Planet, Sumerian researcher Zechariah Sitchin proposed that the landing place described in the epic poem is a megalithic site that can be visited to this day. According to Sitchin, the actual location is Baalbek in Lebanon, where we find this massive platform that resembles what we would think of as a landing court. Today, most people know Baalbek as being the site of the Roman Temple of Jupiter, built in the 1st century BC. But beneath the temple is a massive stone platform that is believed to have been built thousands of years earlier. It is constructed from megalithic blocks that weigh as much as 800 metric tons, or 1.6 million pounds. That platform is incredible because it features some of the largest stones ever carved and created by humans long ago. These blocks are on the 4th level up, so somehow they had to be lifted up. And in my opinion, they had a technology imparted to the local population by the extraterrestrials. As far as ancient astronaut theorists are concerned, the story of the landing pad in the Epic of Gilgamesh, along with King Gudea's encounter with a giant winged being, strongly suggests that the Sumerian people witnessed flying craft coming down from the sky. And they say the most compelling detail of all is the Sumerian description of the god Ningirsu as a thunderbird. When I hear that a giant thunderbird person descended from the sky, I'm like, wait a second, we've heard these stories before. In North America, many First Nation myths begin with thunderbirds, that thunderbirds existed, out of which the so-called Kachinas came, and the Kachinas were the first bringers of knowledge. You have other stories like that also. In ancient India. Imagine you know nothing about technology and then you see a big plane fly over your head. Well, first of all, it looks like a bird. And second of all, it makes a lot of noise, thundering noise. So of course you would call that a thunderbird. And that to me illustrates an example of misunderstood technology. Within the thousands of Sumerian tablets that have been translated are countless stories about the Anunnaki and their interactions with humans. Could they be the first written accounts of extraterrestrial encounters? Perhaps further clues can be found by examining what some researchers believe are the remains of an Anunnaki. The excavations began to reveal an extraordinary necropolis, and as more and more rich funerary goods, pieces of art and jewelry started to come up, it became clear that this was a very important center and had been since Sumerian times. Woolley soon realized that what they had found in the center of Ur was a massive cemetery containing more than 1,800 graves, filled with incredible artifacts and riches, including 16 royal tombs. It was very spectacular, fine, and astonished the world. And Woolley wrote about it in the press as these things became clear and people rushed to get the newspaper to find out the next episode. Because it was very dramatic and very exciting. Woolley's team unearthed one extraordinary relic after another, including a gold cosmetic container in the shape of a cockle shell, a gold vessel in the shape of an ostrich egg, and the head of a lion made of silver, lapis lazuli, and shell. Woolley's team of archaeologists excavated more than one grave with musical instruments and gold and jewelry. They found this classical Sumerian civilization, a very affluent one. Ur was first discovered nearly 70 years before Woolley's excavations, when in 1853 archaeologists unearthed a ziggurat and found it inscribed with the name of the ancient city. It was considered an extraordinary find because biblical scholars believed it was the same city of Ur that is mentioned in the book of Genesis and was the home of Abraham. The Bible tells us the story of Abram. Abram was raised in this city of Ur, and this is important because Abram is considered to be the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike, because the message of Abram was that there is only one true God. During Woolley's excavations in 1926, an even more compelling find was made relating to an event described in both the Bible and the Sumerian text, the Epic of Gilgamesh. As Woolley and his team dug beneath the burials, they got to a depth of about 64 feet where they found a layer of what appeared to be silt, about 13 feet thick, suggesting that flooding had taken place at this time. And the team dug in other spots, 14 in all, and found the exact same thing in all 14 locations. Leonard Woolley believed this was evidence of the Great Flood found in both the Bible and Sumerian texts, and that this was a real event. But of all the discoveries made at Ur, perhaps none are more extraordinary or controversial than a large stone tomb containing the body of a Sumerian queen. Leonard Woolley unearthed This fabulous, incredible tomb of Queen Pwabi, which was an astonishing discovery at the time. They found her body intact, covered with gold ornaments and wearing this incredible golden headdress with cylinder seals attached to her body that identified her as this queen. Numerous artifacts found within the tomb identified it as belonging to Queen Pwabi, and researchers believe she was a very important figure based on the staggering number of jewels that were buried with her. When researcher Zechariah Sitchin examined Pwabi's skull decades later, he determined that while severely damaged, it displayed some remarkable anomalies. As Zechariah Sitchin investigated the discovery of Queen Pwabi, he found that her skull appeared to be elongated. This led him on a line of speculation that she must have been an Anunnaki-human hybrid. Her characteristics look almost alien. Was she possibly some type of extraterrestrial? Queen Pwabi's remains are now housed at the London Museum of Natural History. For years, Zechariah Sitchin implored the museum to test her DNA, but they refused. Unfortunately, mainstream science said, "No, this isn't worthy of our time." To me, this seems like an eye-opener that we have actual remains that could be tested and possibly confirm an extraterrestrial origin. Could the remains of Queen Pwabi provide incontrovertible evidence that the Sumerian civilization was the product of alien intervention? Ancient astronaut theorists believe another, perhaps even more important question, lies in whether this mysterious civilization is much older than archaeologists have ever imagined. Most mainstream historians agree that according to the archaeological evidence, the Sumerians appeared in Mesopotamia around 5000 BC. But in the cuneiform texts that have been translated, the Sumerians themselves say that civilization actually began with their ancestors, who lived thousands of years earlier. This was the time before what the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Hebrew Bible describe as the Great Flood. The origins of the Sumerians is still under scrutiny. Some people have speculated that they may have come from a lost, sunken land. Now, this is an intriguing possibility with all the flood myths and so forth. What is quite interesting related to this is the fact that off the coast of Israel, we have the submerged town of Atlet Yam, which dates back to over 700 BC. It's a series of stone circle structures, avenues, and communal and domestic buildings. And so if there was a submerged area which the Sumerians were said to come from, perhaps we need to look out into the Mediterranean. Do the underwater ruins of Atlet Yam, which date back more than 9,000 years, serve as evidence that the Sumerian stories of a pre-flood civilization are true? Remarkably, even older stone structures had been discovered at the archaeological site of Göbekli Tepe, which is located just 400 miles northwest of ancient Sumer. Göbekli Tepe was discovered in 1994 by Professor Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute. They started finding huge standing stones, and many of these were carved into human form. They would have arms on the side of them, hands that come around to the front. Radiocarbon dating of artifacts unearthed at Göbekli Tepe suggests the ancient site is over 12,000 years old, more than 5,000 years older than the Sumerians. But some researchers have noticed a curious connection between the two cultures. Göbekli Tepe is a massive complex, and it features the carving of these 3 handbags that appear above this bird-like creature. And what's fascinating about this is that you can find carvings of similar handbags about 400 miles to the south where the ancient Sumerians lived. And there, The handbags are held by these winged figures called Anunnaki. This suggests that there is some previously unknown connection between the Sumerians and Göbekli Tepe. Maybe this is the answer for where the Sumerians actually came from. Is it possible that the builders of Göbekli Tepe are the ancient ancestors of the Sumerians? Ancient astronaut theorists believe the answer might be found in the thousands of Sumerian texts that have yet to be translated. Experts estimate that up to 90% of the original texts have been lost, but there must be a treasure trove still out there waiting to be translated, and they could contain information that will force us to rethink everything we thought we knew about our past. The fact that the Sumerians were the first to come up with mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, engineering. Our entire human civilization is built on exactly that, and they've received this knowledge from the so-called gods. And to me, these people that came from the sky weren't, ethereal beings, but extraterrestrials visiting from another planet. Does the discovery of the Sumerians and the recent translations of their ancient clay tablets reveal that humankind and human civilization are the result of alien intervention? And might there be even more astounding revelations about our past, contained within the hundreds of tablets that have yet to be deciphered?